She mocked my startup at her own birthday party, in front of her boss. I smiled, said nothing, and went home. 8 weeks later, I walked into her boardroom as the man who owned everything she'd built her identity around. She didn't see it coming. Nobody did. My name is Paul Bancroft. I'm 46 years old, and for the last 19 years I've been married to a woman I once thought was the most driven, brilliant person I'd ever met. Beverly Bancroft, Senior VP of Global Product Development at Lumeris Beauty Group. If you've ever bought moisturizer at a department store, chances are her name is buried somewhere in the corporate credits. I'm a tech guy. Always have been. I started my company, ChainSync, 7 years ago out of a converted garage in Nashville, Tennessee. We build supply chain management software for mid-sized manufacturers. Not sexy. Not the kind of thing you describe at cocktail parties and watch people lean forward in interest. But it works, it scales, and for the last 2 years the numbers have been doing things I stopped letting myself predict out loud. Beverly never thought much of it. She was always pleasant about it in public. Supportive, even in that performative way, the kind of support that comes with a smile and a subtext. She had her world. 5-star dinners, European product launches, business class lounges, and a LinkedIn profile that looked like an award ceremony. My world was quarterly pipeline reviews and late nights debugging integrations. She'd grown comfortable treating the gap between those worlds as proof that she was the engine of our household. I let her believe it. That was my mistake, and I knew it. But I had a longer plan. The night everything changed was her birthday party. Beverly had organized it herself. She always did. A private dining room at the Stonegate in downtown Nashville, 40 guests, a floors flown in from Atlanta, and a photographer circling the room like a satellite. I wore a suit that cost more than she knew. I shook hands, made small talk, and drank sparkling water all night because I had a 6:30 call the next morning with our Singapore distribution partner. Her boss, Douglas Merritt, was there. So was Kathleen Park, the VP she'd been courting for a joint venture proposal. So were a dozen other people whose approval Beverly collected the way other people collect stamps. It happened around 9 o'clock. Beverly was holding a glass of champagne and laughing at something Douglas had said when she turned and gestured toward me. "Paul is such a sweetheart," she said, loud enough for the table to hear. "He runs his cute little startup. Won't pay our bills, but hey, we'll let him dream, right?" She winked at Douglas and gave me that smile. The one she thought looked affectionate. The one I'd learned to read as something else entirely. Douglas chuckled. Kathleen gave me a polite nod. A few others smiled with their mouths. I raised my glass, sparkling water, and said nothing. Just nodded, once like a man who'd heard a joke that wasn't funny, but wasn't worth the energy. Inside, something clicked into place. Not anger, not humiliation, something colder and more useful than either of those things. On the drive home, Beverly chattered about the evening. Who looked good, who'd had work done, how Kathleen had complimented her earrings. She didn't ask me a single question. I watched the city lights slide past the window and thought about a folder sitting in the back drawer of my home office desk. A folder with one name written on the tab in pencil. Raymond Peck. I hadn't opened it in nearly 3 years. By the time we pulled into the driveway, I had already decided. I told Beverly I had early calls and disappeared into the guest room. She barely looked up from her phone. I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk in the dark, opened my laptop, pulled up ChainSync's back-end financials, and looked at the numbers for a long time. Month-over-month retention was up 14%. 3 enterprise contracts had cleared legal review. Cash position was the strongest it had ever been. Then I opened the folder and found Raymond Peck's old number. I wrote 3 words in a text and hit send. "Time to talk." His reply came at 11:47 p.m. Name the place. Raymond Peck lived in a farmhouse outside Woodstock, Vermont, and hadn't practiced law in 4 years. But the man who picked up the phone at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning sounded like someone who'd never stopped thinking like a lawyer. "You sound like you've been up all night," he said. "Close enough," I told him. "Then let's not waste the morning. When can you get here?" I booked a flight to Burlington for Thursday. I told Beverly I had a partner summit in Boston. She nodded from behind her coffee mug and asked me to grab more of that French roast on my way back. That was the entirety of her interest in my travel plans. The drive from Burlington to Raymond's place took 40 minutes through countryside that looked like it belonged on a calendar. I found him on the porch with a thermos and a legal pad, already writing. He was 67, lean, with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of stillness that comes from spending decades in rooms where every word costs something. We shook hands. He poured me coffee. We sat. "Tell me what you're looking at," he said. I handed him a thumb drive. On over 18 months of research I'd been compiling quietly. The corporate structure of Narrated Beauty Group, its parent entity, the holding companies above it, the venture debt layered through the whole stack. I'd started building it the way I built everything, systematically, without broadcasting what I was doing or why. Raymond plugged the drive into an old laptop, scrolled without speaking for several minutes, and then leaned back. "Parallax Capital," he said finally. "They're the majority stakeholder too, levels up." "Overextended," I said. "They took a significant hit on a clean energy acquisition in Brazil 18 months ago. Floating rate debt. They've been quietly shopping assets." Raymond nodded slowly. "And Narrated is one of them." "Not yet, but will be. The question is whether someone gets there first with a clean offer." He looked at me over his glasses. "Someone like you. Someone structured correctly," I said. "Nothing with my name on it." Raymond set down his coffee and folded his hands. He was quiet for a moment in the way he always got when he was organizing a plan rather than considering whether to make one. That was the thing about Raymond. He'd made up his mind before you finished the sentence. He just needed to build the architecture. "You'd need a layered acquisition structure," he said. "Limited partnership, offshore holding, clean buyer identity, legal firm with no press presence. I know what I need. I need you to help me build it." He smiled, small, controlled. "You're sure about this?" She stood up at her own birthday party and told her boss that my company was a cute little hobby that wouldn't pay the bills. In front of 40 people. I paused. "So yes, Raymond. I'm sure." He picked up his legal pad and started writing. On the flight home, I sat in the back row and thought about Victor Crane. Victor and I had started ChainSync together 8 years ago. Two guys with a product idea in a shared office in a co-working space near Midtown. Beverly had never liked him. "Too rough around the edges," she said. "Too loud. Not the kind of partner that reflects well." She'd made her opinions known with that quiet persistence she used when she wanted something done without appearing to demand it. By the third year, Victor had bought out and walked. I let it happen. That was something I'd carried since. Victor had landed on his feet, better than landed, actually. He'd taken his buyout, invested it well, and was now running a boutique venture fund out of Atlanta with a reputation for finding undervalued mid-market technology plays. We'd had coffee twice in the last year. Neither of us had mentioned Beverly. Neither of us had needed to. I texted him from 30,000 feet. "I've got something I want to walk you through." Not over the phone. He replied in 11 minutes. "Atlanta or Nashville?" "Nashville. Next week." Done. Back home, I moved my operational base into the guest room with quiet efficiency. Early calls, late nights, keyboard noise, I told Beverly. She accepted the explanation without blinking. And within 2 days, she'd mentioned how nice it was to have the closet to herself. I noted that, filed it away next to everything else. That same week, I found Ethan Bowman. He was 27, working at a boutique data analytics firm in Nashville, and his LinkedIn showed 18 months at Narrated Beauty Group, terminated, per the gap in his timeline, about 2 years prior. I'd heard his name from a contact in the industry. Beverly had fired him personally, apparently. Told HR he lacked presence. Wasn't executive material. I met him for lunch at a diner on Charlotte Avenue. He ordered black coffee and a sandwich and didn't make small talk. "I know who you are," he said, before I could start. "I figured this conversation would happen eventually." "What makes you say that?" I asked. Ethan looked at me evenly. "Because I know what Narrated looks like from the inside. And I know what someone who's actually paying attention looks like from the outside." He picked up his coffee. "So, what do you need?" I told him to finish his sandwich first. Then I told him everything. Victor Crane showed up to our meeting 15 minutes early, which told me everything I needed to know about where his head was. He'd driven up from Atlanta in a rented Suburban, walked into the coffee shop on West End with his jacket folded over one arm, and ordered a black coffee before I'd even sat down. 49 years old, heavier than I remembered, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from having been right about something important and patient enough to let time prove it. We shook hands. He held mine a beat longer than necessary. "You look like a man with a plan," he said. "I look like a man who should have called you 3 years ago," I said. Victor waved it off and sat down. "We're here now. Walk me through it." I did. The full picture, Narrated, Parallax Capital, the debt exposure, Raymond's involvement, the shell structure we were building. Victor listened the way he always had, without interrupting, one hand around his coffee, eyes steady. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Capital participation and connectivity," I said. "You've got relationships with two of the distressed portfolio funds that are holding parallax debt. I need introductions, quiet ones." "How quiet?" "Nothing traceable back to Chain Sync or to me personally. The buyer identity needs to stay clean through closing." Victor nodded slowly. "I can do that, but I want to be clear about something first." He leaned forward. "This isn't about your wife." I looked at him. "I mean that as a business principle," he said. "The moment this becomes personal, the structure gets emotional. Emotional structures leak. So whatever she did, and I can imagine, it stays outside the room." "Agreed. Agreed," I said. And I meant it, because he was right. That was the thing about Victor. He'd always been right. Meanwhile, Ethan Bowman had started delivering. The kid was methodical in a way that went beyond training. It was almost architectural, the way he organized information. Within 10 days of our lunch meeting, he produced a 40-page internal analysis of Lumerus's parent structure, complete with subsidiary maps, historical vendor contracts, and a detailed breakdown of which licensing agreements carried the most exploitable clauses. He flagged one in particular. A legacy exclusivity agreement with a European fragrance distributor that prohibited third-party licensing arrangements in the Asia-Pacific region without written consent from the original party. The clause had been drafted 7 years ago and largely forgotten, buried in a contract renewal that Beverly's legal team had rubber-stamped without deep review. "She's going to want to move on Asian markets," Ethan said when he walked me through it. "Her Q3 projections have been circulating internally for weeks. She's under pressure to show international growth numbers. And when she does," I asked, "she'll trip this clause without realizing it, especially if the right opportunity is sitting in front of her at the right time." I looked at Ethan across the table, 27 years old, calm as still water, eating a sandwich like we were discussing weather patterns. "You said Beverly fired you personally," I said. "She did. Did it make you angry?" Ethan thought about it for a second. "It made me accurate," he said. "Angry wastes energy. Accurate gets results." I decided then that he was the best hire I'd made in years. The piece that completed the picture was James' one. James, and I went back to the earliest version of Chain Sync, before it had a name, when it was just a product concept I was pitching to anyone who'd sit still long enough. He'd been running a mid-size electronics distribution operation out of Shenzhen at the time, and he'd taken a chance on a 3-month pilot when nobody else would. We'd stayed close. He called me every few months, always direct, always brief, always with something worth hearing. I called him on a Sunday evening, Nashville time. It was Monday morning for him. "You're calling about something real," he said. It wasn't a question. "I need a favor that looks like a business opportunity," I said. "A licensing approach. Fragrance distribution. Asia Pacific. Structured to look attractive to a company that's hungry for regional numbers." Silence for a moment. "Who's the company?" I told him. Another silence. Then, "Your wife's employer." "Yes. And the contract will have problems. Carefully constructed ones," I said. James was quiet for 5 full seconds. Then he said, "You know what I owe you. Send me the framework. I'll review it by Wednesday." That same week, Beverly left for a 3-day product summit in Paris. She sent me a photo from the airport lounge. Champagne, bright smile, caption, "Wish you were here, babe." I replied with a thumbs-up emoji and went back to the acquisition framework documents open on my secure laptop. By Thursday, Parallax Capital had received a quiet, non-binding letter of interest from a Zurich-registered fintech entity whose actual ownership would have taken a forensic accountant 3 weeks to untangle. They responded within 48 hours. They were interested. "I want to tell you something about building a shell company. People think it's dramatic, secret meetings, briefcases, offshore accounts with suspicious names. The reality is almost boring. It's paperwork. Precise, layered, sequential paperwork executed by professionals who've done it 500 times and have no emotional investment in any of it. That's exactly what makes it effective." Raymond had connected me with a legal firm in Delaware, 3 founding partners, 0 press presence, a client list that read like a who's who of people who understood the value of discretion. Within 3 weeks, they'd established a limited partnership in the Caymans, 2 holding structures in Cyprus, and a buyer entity that presented to the outside world as a fintech advisory group out of Zurich called Ardenvale Partners. Nobody at Lumaris or Parallax Capital had heard of Ardenvale Partners. That was the point. While the structure was being assembled, I kept my personal life exactly calibrated. I went to Ryan's lacrosse alumni dinner at Vanderbilt and sat in the stands making conversation with other parents. I attended Beverly's firm holiday happy hour as her +1 and shook hands with Douglas Merritt and smiled at the right moments. I cooked dinner twice a week and left her coffee ready in the mornings. Beverly, for her part, was in a particularly good mood that month. She'd been selected to present at a European brand summit in Geneva, and the invitation had arrived on official letterhead that she'd photographed and posted to LinkedIn with the caption, "Honored to represent the future of global beauty." 47 people had liked it. I was one of them. Ryan called me that week for Nashville. He was studying for midterms, he said, but had seen his mother's post. "She seems pumped," he said. "She always is when the calendar looks good." I told him. "How's the company?" Ryan asked. He always asked about ChainSync with genuine interest. Had since he was 16, and I'd walked him through the product logic on a whiteboard in the garage. "Moving," I said, quietly. "The good kind of quiet. The best kind," I said. He laughed and told me to call more often. I told him I would and meant it. Meanwhile, Ardenvale Partners had done exactly what a serious buyer does. They'd commissioned a quiet due diligence review of Parallax Capital's portfolio, established credibility through a small preliminary position in one of Parallax's secondary holdings, and submitted a revised letter of interest, this time with a proposed term sheet attached. Victor had made the introductions he'd promised, clean and professional, through a contact at a distressed debt fund in New York who had no idea the chain led back to me. Parallax's board was communicating with Ardenvale's legal representatives. Nobody in that chain knew my name. But here's what nobody outside our circle knew yet. Beverly had taken the bait. James Wynn's approach had been perfectly staged. His distribution company, under a subsidiary name, had reached out to Lumaris's Asia-Pacific development team with a licensing proposal that looked exactly like the kind of fast-track regional opportunity Beverly had been hunting for her Q3 numbers. Good margins, established infrastructure, a clean-looking contract that Beverly's team reviewed in 72 hours because she'd pushed for speed. I was in the guest room when she texted me. "Just closed a major Asia deal. Q3 is going to be massive. Don't wait up." I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the desk. From across the room, Ethan's earlier words came back to me. She'll trip this clause without realizing it. She had 3 separate breach conditions, all activated simultaneously by a single signature. Ethan's analysis had been exact. The licensing error wasn't negligence on Beverly's part. It was velocity. She moved fast, cut corners on review, and trusted that her instincts were sharper than the fine print. They weren't. I opened my secure laptop and typed a single line to Raymond. "Phase 2 is active." His reply was immediate. "Understood. Notice is ready. Your call on timing." I closed the laptop, went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood at the window, looking out at the dark backyard. Beverly's car was in the driveway. The lights in the neighborhood were going out one by one. I thought about that birthday party. The champagne glass. The wink. Douglas Merritt's polite chuckle. Won't pay our bills, but hey, we let him dream. I finished my water, rinsed the glass, and went to bed. The notices could wait until morning. Beverly came home from Geneva on a Thursday evening with a rolling carry-on and the particular glow that expensive travel gives people who believe they've earned it. She dropped her bag in the entryway, kissed me on the cheek, and spent 45 minutes on the phone with her assistant before she even sat down for dinner. I made pasta. She ate half of it and talked about Geneva the whole time. Who'd presented, who'd been impressive, what the venue had looked like at night. She mentioned Douglas Merritt twice and Kathleen Park 3 times. She didn't ask about my week. I refilled her water glass and listened and said the right things at the right intervals. What I didn't mention was that earlier that day, Raymond had confirmed Ardenvale Partners was now in formal negotiation with Parallax Capital. The structure was holding. The buyer identity was clean. And Ethan had just delivered a second analysis. This one focused on the internal communications patterns at Lumaris, specifically the velocity with which Beverly's division approved vendor contracts. Fast. Always fast. Speed was her brand, her signature, her competitive identity. "I need you to understand something," Ethan had said at our last meeting, spreading his notes across the diner table. "She doesn't read contracts. She reads summaries. Her assistant flags the commercial terms, price, timeline, territory, and Beverly makes the call in under 20 minutes if the numbers look right. The legal review is a formality she treats like a speed bump." "So James's contract," I said, "will land exactly the way she likes them to land," Ethan said. "Clean summary, good numbers, regional opportunity that fits her Q3 narrative. She'll sign within a week of receiving it." He was off by 2 days. She signed in 5. I found out from James on a Saturday morning. He sent a single text. "Done. Your move." That afternoon, Beverly was in a spectacular mood. She poured herself a glass of wine at 2 in the afternoon, put on music in the kitchen, and told me that her Asian expansion initiative was going to define her Q3 performance review. She was talking about a promotion, not speculating, stating. She said Douglas had as much as confirmed it at a dinner in Geneva. "Things are really moving," she said, swirling her glass. "Sounds like it," I said. I was standing at the kitchen counter going through mail. One of the envelopes was a statement from the brokerage account I discovered 3 months ago. The one in Beverly's name alone. The one our financial auditor had traced through 4 years of quiet redirections from our joint investment accounts. $41,000. Moved in increments small enough to avoid triggering review. I set the statement in the folder I kept locked in my desk drawer. My attorney, Nora Vale, had been copied on the last 3 months of documentation. I'd met Nora through a corporate law referral 8 months prior. Before any of this had started, back when I was simply restructuring ChainSync's equity agreements. She was 41, precise, with a kind of dry composure that made opposing counsel visibly uncomfortable. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She built arguments the way engineers build load-bearing structures. Every element in the right place. Nothing decorative. When I'd brought her into the fuller picture 2 months ago, she'd listened without surprise and said, "You've been thorough." "I had time," I said. "The financial redirection alone is grounds," she said. "But combined with the acquisition context and the marital asset documentation, you're building something that will be very difficult to contest." Beverly had filed for divorce 3 weeks ago. That part still surprised people when I told them. She'd been the one to pull the trigger. Came home one Tuesday evening and announced, with the calm of someone who'd rehearsed it, that she felt they'd grown in different directions, and that she thought it was time to formalize what had already become obvious. She'd already retained an attorney. She handed me a card. I took it, looked at it, and said I'd be in touch with my representation. She seemed mildly surprised that I didn't argue. I think she'd expected tears, or anger, or at minimum a long conversation she'd prepared to win. Instead, I put the card on the counter, poured myself a glass of water, and asked if she wanted dinner. What she didn't know, what her attorney didn't know, was that she'd filed in the middle of a corporate acquisition in which her primary asset, her career, her equity, her professional identity, was about to be fundamentally restructured. Her attorney was preparing a standard high-income divorce case. Nora was preparing something else entirely. The timing, as Raymond liked to say, was everything. The first sign came on a Monday. Beverly walked into the kitchen that morning with her phone in one hand and the expression of someone who just read an email that didn't make sense. She poured coffee, read the screen again, and set the phone face down on the counter with slightly more force than necessary. "Everything okay?" I asked from behind my laptop. "Internal stuff," she said. "Nothing major." She left for the office 20 minutes later. I waited until I heard her car back out of the driveway, then opened my secure laptop and pulled up the notification dashboard Raymond's team had built, a clean, real-time view of legal trigger events as they propagated through Lumeris's corporate structure. 3 breach notifications had been sent. 2 had been formally acknowledged by Lumeris's general counsel. The third was pending a board-level review request from the European licensing partner. The cascade was moving exactly the way Ethan had mapped it. By Wednesday of that week, Beverly came home distracted. She ate dinner without commenting on the food, checked her phone 4 times during the meal, and answered a call at the table that she took out to the back porch. I could hear fragments through the glass door, her voice rising slightly, then dropping, then the controlled flat tone she used when she was angry and containing it. She came back in and said her CMO was dealing with something complicated. Anything you can resolve? I asked. Not tonight, she said. And she said it the way people say things when they mean, not ever. Thursday brought the joint memo, a board-level communication citing material compliance concerns and announcing a temporary freeze on new vendor contracts pending legal review. Beverly called me from the office at noon, voice tight. Someone is moving against us, she said. I can feel it. This isn't random. The timing is too precise. The pressure points are too specific. Somebody knows our internal structure. Could be a competitor, I offered. Competitors don't know which clauses to pull, she snapped. This is surgical. Whoever this is, they had inside information. I made a sound of sympathy and told her to keep me posted. That evening she sat across from me at the dinner table and said, for the first time in our marriage, I'm scared, Paul. I don't know who's behind this. I looked at her. 19 years of marriage. The birthday party. The champagne glass. The wink. You'll figure it out, I said. You always do. She nodded, reassured, and went back to her phone. What she didn't know was that Don Harriman had called me 2 days earlier. Don, her trusted boardroom mentor, the man who'd championed her career for a decade, had reached out through an intermediary with a single message. I want you to know I'm aware of what's happening. I won't be standing in the way. Don had known my father's business partner, had tracked my career from a careful distance, had understood, from the moment Beverly had introduced us 6 years ago at a company event, exactly what was being built on both sides of that marriage. He'd stayed neutral as long as the situation was manageable. Now that the situation had changed, he'd chosen his side. Beverly's career had given her a mentor. My patients had given me one too. The week ended with Lumorous's CFO requesting an emergency financial review. Beverly described it over dinner on Friday as an overreaction to routine compliance issues. She said it with conviction. I nodded and passed the bread. Behind the guest room door that night, Raymond's message was waiting. Parallax has accepted preliminary terms. Closing window, 4 to 6 weeks. I read it twice, turned off the lamp, and slept better than I had in months. Beverly hired a private investigator in the 3rd week of October. I found out from Nora, who'd been monitoring certain legal filings as a precaution and had flagged an inquiry submitted to a licensed PI firm in Nashville on Beverly's behalf. The scope of the investigation, based on the intake paperwork Nora's contact had obtained, was focused on my business activities, specifically whether ChainSync had undisclosed financial interests that might affect the divorce asset calculation. I wasn't worried. I was almost impressed. The investigator, a retired Metro Nashville detective named Gary Hollis, spent 8 days on the assignment. He pulled ChainSync's public filings, attended 2 events where I was scheduled to speak, photographed my office building from a parking lot across the street, and at one point followed me to a lunch meeting with Victor Crane in Brentwood. Victor had spotted the tail immediately. He'd said nothing, finished his meal, and texted me from the parking lot afterward. You've got a shadow. Gray Camry, 2 rows back. He's not very good at this. I thanked him and told Raymond. Raymond had laughed, the dry, controlled laugh of a man who found other people's incomplete plans genuinely amusing. She hired someone to find a thing that doesn't have her husband's name on it, he said. It won't have her husband's name on it. Hollis delivered his report to Beverly's attorney 10 days later. His conclusion: Paul Bancroft operated a legitimate software company with strong recurring revenue and no identified offshore interests or undisclosed assets. Standard successful founder profile. Nothing actionable. Beverly called me after she'd read it. I could hear the specific frustration of someone who'd expected a different answer. Your business is doing well, she said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a recalibration. I've been saying that for a while, I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the divorce process is going to take longer than I thought. Take all the time you need, I said. What Nora had told me that same week was that the prenuptial agreement Beverly had signed before her wedding, the one she'd accepted with a wave of her hand and a comment about how lawyers made everything complicated, contained a financial misconduct clause. Undisclosed personal accounts funded by redirected joint assets qualified as financial misconduct. Nora had 3 years of documented transfers and 4 months of brokerage statements. Beverly's attorney had found the prenup. Beverly's attorney had gone quiet. The week before the Ardenvale closing, I drove to Vermont to see Raymond one last time. We sat on his porch with coffee in the October cold and went through the final sequence together. The closing mechanics, the integration structure, the board notifications, the specific morning on which Beverly would walk in her office building not yet knowing that the company she worked for had a new owner. You thought about what you're going to say when she figures it out? Raymond asked. I'm not going to say much, I told him. That's been the whole point. Raymond nodded. Your father would have liked this, he said. It was the only personal thing he said all afternoon. On the drive back to Burlington, I called Ryan. He was between classes, eating lunch in the student union, and picked up on the second ring. Hey, Dad. What's up? Just checking in, I said. How are midterms treating you? Surviving, he said. Barely. A pause. Is everything okay? You sound, I don't know. Settled. Yeah, I said. I think I am. Mom called me last week, he said. She said the divorce was getting complicated. It is, I said honestly. She said it was because of your business stuff. I chose my next words carefully. Ryan, in the next couple of weeks, some things are going to become clear. I'm not going to ask you to take sides, but I need you to trust that I've handled everything the way it needed to be handled. A pause. Longer than I expected. Then, I've always trusted that, Dad. I drove the rest of the way to Burlington without the radio on. The boardroom was on the 41st floor of Lumeris's Nashville headquarters, floor-to-ceiling glass, a long table in dark oak, the kind of room designed to communicate authority to whoever sat in it. Beverly walked in at 9:22, 8 minutes after the meeting was scheduled to begin. I knew the time because Raymond had someone in the lobby with a sight line to the elevator bank. I was already seated at the far end of the table when she entered. She didn't see me immediately. She was scanning the room, the unfamiliar faces, the absence of her CFO's usual position at the head, the two HR representatives standing against the wall like sentinels. Her eyes moved past the legal team from Ardenvale, past the two board members she recognized, but who weren't making eye contact, and landed, for a half second, on Don Harriman, who looked at his legal pad and didn't look up. Then she saw me. I watched the sequence happen in her face. First, confusion. Her brain running a check. Why is Paul here? Then, the beginning of an explanation forming. Something rational. Something that still made sense within the world she understood. Then, the explanation failing. Then something else entirely. I didn't stand. I didn't smile. I opened the folder in front of me and said, to the room, let's get started. We have a lot of ground to cover. Beverly's voice came out controlled, which told me she was working harder than she looked. Paul, what is this? A transition meeting, I said. Effective this morning, Ardenvale Partners holds a controlling interest in Lumeris Beauty Group through its parent acquisition of Parallax Capital. I'm the principal of Ardenvale. The CFO, seated 2 chairs from Beverly, closed his eyes briefly. That's not, Beverly started. She stopped. You can't just, she stopped again. I looked at her steadily. The documentation is in front of you. The legal team will walk through the transition structure in detail. Your role remains intact through Q4, with performance review at the start of the new cycle. You built this to get back at me, she said. Her voice had dropped, not to a whisper, but to the register people use when they want the room to pretend it didn't hear something. I held her gaze. I built this because I know how to build things, Beverly. That's what I've been doing the entire time you were telling people I couldn't pay the bills. The room was silent in the way rooms get when everyone has stopped breathing at the same moment. Beverly sat down, not because she decided to, because her legs made the decision for her. Don Harriman, to his credit, kept his eyes on his legal pad. I turned to the Ardenvale legal team. Let's begin with the integration timeline. And we did. The envelope was on Beverly's desk when she returned from the boardroom. Cream-colored, thick stock, her name written in clean block letters. No title, just her name. The embossed logo in the upper left corner belonged to Ardenvale Partners. She told me later, through her attorney, that she'd stood in the doorway of her own office for almost a full minute before she could bring herself to pick it up. I wasn't there for that part. I heard about it secondhand, the way you hear about things that happen on the other side of a wall you built. What was inside? A formal reassignment letter, an NDA addendum standard to ownership transitions, and a yellow sticky note in my handwriting with 4 words. Not so little anymore. The reassignment moved her from Senior VP of Global Product Development to Strategic Advisor, North American Markets. Same salary through the end of the year. direct reporting line to the incoming chief technology officer, a role I would be filling through the transition period. Her attorney called Nora within 2 hours. The conversation, by Nora's account, was loud on one end and very quiet on the other. The divorce proceedings shifted that same week. Beverly's legal team had finally done a full read of the prenuptial agreement, and what they'd found in Section 14 had apparently required a long internal conversation before anyone was willing to discuss it with Beverly directly. The financial misconduct clause was unambiguous. 3 years of documented asset redirection into a personal account qualified cleanly under its language. Nora told me Beverly's attorney had requested a settlement conference rather than continuing to litigated discovery. That's what people do, Nora said, when they realized the math stopped working in their favor. We met in a conference room on a Wednesday afternoon. Beverly, her attorney, me, Nora. Beverly was composed in the particular way of someone who has accepted an outcome they're still furious about. She sat straight, hands folded, and looked at the table rather than at me for most of it. At one point, her attorney raised the question of the Ardenvale acquisition, whether the corporate structure constituted a marital asset subject to division. Nora let the question finish, then opened a binder. ChainSync's capitalization structure, she explained, predated any of the redirected joint funds by 4 years. The Ardenvale vehicle had been funded entirely through ChainSync operating revenue and a personal investment account that had been maintained separately and disclosed in full in the original prenup financial schedule. There was nothing to divide. Beverly looked up then, looked at me directly for the first time all afternoon. I held her gaze and said nothing. Her attorney asked for a brief recess. We settled 3 weeks later. Beverly retained the house. She'd wanted it, and I had no interest in fighting over real estate. She received a fair spousal support structure for 3 years. The personal account she'd quietly built was treated as a marital asset under the misconduct clause, folded back into the settlement calculation, and effectively neutralized her leverage entirely. She kept her position at Lumaris through the end of Q4 as promised. She was professional about it, as far as I could tell. Her team respected her. The transition, operationally, was smooth. Ryan came home for Thanksgiving that year. He sat across from me at the kitchen table in my new apartment, a clean, spare 2-bedroom near the Gulch that I'd furnished with exactly what I needed and nothing more, and we ate takeout from a place he liked on 12th Avenue and talked for 3 hours straight. About ChainSync, about his coursework, about what he wanted to do after graduation, about the years that had just passed. At one point he said, "I used to think you were just letting her win." "I know," I said. "I get it now," he said. I poured us both more coffee and didn't need to add anything to that. The week after Thanksgiving, Nora called to confirm that all settlement documents had been executed. Clean, complete, final. She said it the way she said most things, without ceremony, because the work spoke for itself. That same afternoon, Victor Crane sent me a text. "Drinks when you're ready. You owe me a good bottle." I replied, "Name the place." I sat at my desk in the ChainSync office afterward and looked out the window at the Nashville skyline, going gold in the late afternoon. The company's ARR had crossed a milestone I'd stopped letting myself predict out loud 2 years ago. 3 new enterprise contracts were in final review. The Ardenvale portfolio was generating exactly the returns the model had projected. I thought about Beverly at that birthday party. The champagne glass. The wink. Won't pay our bills, but hey, we let him dream. I never needed her permission to dream. I just needed time to build. The press event was held on a Thursday morning in December, in the ground floor atrium of Lumaris's Nashville headquarters, a clean, modern space that the communications team had dressed with soft lighting and tasteful branded materials. About 60 people, board members, department heads, a handful of trade press, a few investors who'd been quietly connected to the transition. Nora was there. She stood near the back in a charcoal blazer, coffee in hand, watching with the calm attention of someone who understood everything that had led to this moment. We'd crossed a professional line in the last 2 months. Nothing dramatic, nothing rushed. Dinner twice, a long conversation at a rooftop bar in the Gulch where she'd told me about her own divorce 4 years ago, and I'd listened the way she'd listened to me. Something honest and unhurried had taken root, and I decided to let it grow at its own pace. Beverly was present too. She stood with her team near the left side of the room, composed and professional. We'd been civil throughout the transition. More than civil, Actually, there was no drama in the office, no public display of whatever the private reality had been. She was good at her job, and she kept doing it, and I'd respected that. The board chair opened the formal remarks and walked the room through the transition timeline. When he introduced me as the principal of Ardenvale Partners and incoming executive chair of the parent entity, I stepped to the podium and said what needed to be said, clean, brief, focused on the company's future and the team's work. I didn't look at Beverly during any of it. Afterward, in the corridor outside the atrium, a reporter from a Nashville business journal caught me for a comment. She asked the standard questions, strategy, vision, what had drawn me to this particular acquisition. I gave her the standard answers, because the real answer wasn't hers to have. Someone else, a board member whose name I won't use, leaned over as the reporter walked away and said, in a low voice with a slight smile, "Was any of this personal?" I buttoned my jacket and thought about it honestly for a moment. "It started personal," I said. "It became business. That's how the best ones usually go." He laughed and moved on. Ryan called that evening from Vanderbilt, having seen the trade press coverage. "Dad," he said, "it's all over the business feeds." "I know," I said. "How do you feel?" I was standing at the window of my apartment, looking out at the city lights the way I'd looked at them from a car window 2 years ago, the night of Beverly's birthday party, when everything had been wrong and I'd known exactly what I needed to do about it. "I feel like myself," I said, probably for the first time in a long time. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good. That's what I wanted to hear." We talked for another 40 minutes, about his final schedule, about whether he wanted to do a summer internship at ChainSync, about what we'd do for Christmas. Normal things. Good things. The kind of conversation a father and son have when the weight that had been sitting between them for years has finally been moved. After we hung up, I poured a small glass of bourbon, sat in the chair by the window, and let the quiet settle. I thought about Raymond on his porch in Vermont, legal pad in hand, the October cold around us, saying, "Your father would have liked this." I thought about Victor spotting a gray Camry in a Brentwood parking lot and saying nothing until we were outside. I thought about Ethan Bowman eating a sandwich and saying, "Angry wastes energy. Accurate gets results." I thought about the birthday party, the champagne, the wink, 40 guests, and a joke that wasn't one. And then I let it go. Because that part was done. The company was running. The settlement was signed. The apartment was mine. My son was proud of me in a way he didn't need to say out loud because I could hear it every time he called. Some men build things to prove a point. I'd built this one because I knew how. Because the work itself had always been enough reason. The point had just taken care of itself along the way. I finished the bourbon, rinsed the glass, went to bed. Tomorrow there was work to do, and I was exactly the right person to do it.